April 22, 1945. Hitler, in his bunker in Berlin, has been asking all morning about the results of the offensive that Steiner should have started during the first hours of that day. Finally, at the midday meeting, his top advisors can no longer hide the reality and inform him that Steiner has been unable to launch any offensive. This news meant that Zhukov's First Belarusian Front would continue to concentrate all its efforts on the assault on Berlin, which, also being attacked by Konya from the south, would soon be surrounded. Once Berlin was isolated, there was little guarantee that its weak garrison could contain the Soviet advance towards central Berlin. The capital of the Reich was finally surrounded on April 24, from which point a relentless Soviet advance began towards the central district of Berlin, nicknamed the Citadel, where the main buildings of the German government were located, and the own bunker where Hitler was. During the day of April 28, the Soviets reached the north bank of the Spree River, finally being able to see the great building of the Reichstag, in a similar way to the one that 3.5 years before the Germans had seen the Kremlin in Moscow. However, the difference was clear. While the Germans had come to see the Kremlin with their last breath, the Soviets still had strength and energy to continue attacking with great ferocity. Although the Soviets thought that the Reichstag was Hitler's main building of power, and therefore the one they had set as their priority objective, the truth was that since the fire of 1933, the building had not been used in any way officially for any parliamentary session. In reality, the important government building was the Reich Chancellery, located about 700 meters to the southeast, which housed Hitler's bunker in its backyard. Other important buildings located in that sector of the Citadel were the Kroll Opera and the Ministry of the Interior building, which were located in front of the Reichstag. Because the Soviets crossed the river just northwest of the Reichstag, these two were the buildings they first encountered. Both the Reichstag building and the Ministry of the Interior were very solid stone constructions that withstood all the artillery impacts very well. To prepare for the defense of both buildings, most of the windows and doors were bricked up with stone blocks or wood, and sandbags were stacked against their walls. There were machine guns in the corner towers, and above the main entrance there were entrenched positions, forming interlocking fields of fire. Despite the numerous bombings by both the aviation and the one that the Soviet artillery was beginning to carry out against them, the thick walls absorbed the punishment without collapsing. The central government sector in Berlin would be the toughest nut for the Soviets to crack, as it contained most of the elite troops still remaining in the capital. In the vicinity of the Reichstag building was Waffen SS General Wilhelm Mohnke, who had been appointed Commander-in-Chief of the defense of the government district of Berlin, nicknamed the Citadel. The main core of his forces was the Waffen SS Guard battalion belonging to the Leibstandard, assigned to Hitler's protection, which was made up of about 800 men. They were joined by other Waffen SS units whose headquarters were in Berlin, which included troops from Himmler's Guard, whose strength amounted to 600 men. Finally, it should be noted that there were also a few dozen French soldiers belonging to the SS Charlemagne Division, who had been part of the destroyed SS Norland Division. It should be said that the rest of the elite units of the Waffen SS, including the rest of the Leibstandard, Das Reich, Totenkopf, Viking, and Hitlerjugend, were in the vicinity of Vienna after their failed offensive in the vicinity of the Lake Balaton, and the subsequent Soviet counterattack. Russian officers on the north bank of the Spree River thought that there were about 5,000 German soldiers in the vicinity of the Reichstag. However, in reality, it was defended by no more than 2,000 troops. Of all of them, about 550 men were entrenched inside the Reichstag building, ready to fight their final battle. One of the main protagonists in the defense of the Reichstag building was Waffen SS Lieutenant Barbick, who was in command of one of the Leibstandard companies made up of 100 soldiers. Shortly before the Soviet assault on his position, Barbick received another 100 men from the decimated 9th Parachute Division, which had been retreating from the Silo Hills. With regard to heavy weapons support, Barbick had only two 88mm guns outside the Reichstag, and could also count on the large 128mm guns at the Flak Tower west of Tiergarten Park, which were about 2 kilometers from your position. Luckily for the German lieutenant, he still had telephone contact with the garrison of this anti-aircraft tower. Thus, on April 27, the German lieutenant established his command post in the basement of a ruined house behind the Reichstag and prepared for battle. On the other hand, Stalin had informed his two front commanders, Marshals Zhukov and Konev, that capturing the Reichstag would mean winning the race to take Berlin. Soviet forces, belonging to Zhukov's First Belarusian Front, had reached the banks of the Spree River during the night of April 27. In front of them was the Maltka Bridge, which led them directly to the Reichstag, between the destroyed buildings of the Kroll Opera and the Ministry of the Interior, which the Soviets called Himmler's house. It was not going to be easy for them to cross the bridge, which would form a bottleneck that would cause heavy casualties, but they had no other option. The Soviet plan was to send a couple of battalions across the bridge, take the diplomatic headquarters, and then assault the Ministry of the Interior with new forces that had already crossed the river. The attacking Soviet 79th Rifle Corps had 3 infantry divisions available. Each division had 2 regiments of 3 battalions, each with about 500 men per battalion. In addition, the 23rd Tank Brigade was also present to help. In total, the Soviet assault force is estimated at least 10,000 infantry and about 80 tanks. The attack began with thunderous fire from Soviet artillery, using both artillery guns and rocket launchers, which bombarded the vicinity of the Reichstag before the infantry began to cross the bridge. It was shortly after midnight on April 29 when the Soviet artillery opened fire, which was followed by the infantry assault. By dawn, the best units of the 150th and 171st Rifle Divisions had entered the diplomatic quarter, under direct fire from the 128mm guns on the Zoo Tower, 2 kilometers away. Despite the distance at which it was located, the support given by this anti-aircraft tower was vital, since it managed to destroy most of the Soviet tanks that tried to cross the bridge. While the Russians were establishing their first positions south of the Spree River, the Germans counterattacked with the remains of the 9th Parachute Division, which charged along the river bank on the Soviet left flank. Due to the weakness of the attack, in which barely 100 men participated, the German counterattack quickly stalled. Subsequently, the survivors of the 9th Parachute Division retreated inside the Reichstag. On the other hand, members of the Soviet 150th Division attacked the Ministry of the Interior, which due to its large size and the tenacity of its defenders, could not be taken until the afternoon of April 30th. Although the defenders were fewer than the Soviets thought, the resistance was much greater. Regardless of the difficulties encountered, Stalin wanted the Reichstag to be taken before May 1st, so that the red flag could be raised on its roof, due to the strong symbolic load of said date. To meet this demand, Soviet commanders on the ground were forced to redouble their efforts. To this end, the exhausted battalions of the 150th Rifle Division launched an assault on the Reichstag at 7:30 a.m. on April 30th, which was repulsed by the Waffen SS troops defending the building. During that morning, General Wilhelm Mohnke himself had gone to Hitler's bunker to inform him that the resistance of his men would only be possible for 20 more hours. After that time, the Soviets would reach Hitler's bunker. Shortly after the first Soviet assault on the Reichstag was repulsed, the 207th Rifle Division was sent to capture the Kroll Opera House. This attack made some progress, and tanks, self-propelled guns, and Katyusha rocket launchers were used to reinforce the assault. After the failure of the first assault on the Reichstag, the second Soviet attempt took place at 11:30 a.m. Unfortunately for them, the Germans also managed to stop him, although they were running out of ammunition. Shortly later, around 1 p.m., the Soviets carried out a third attempt, which was also stopped short thanks to the help of shots fired from the anti-aircraft tower southwest of the Tiergarten. Meanwhile, at 6 in the afternoon, the Kroll Opera completely fell into Soviet hands. Less than a kilometer from there, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker around 4 in the afternoon. The final Soviet assault on the Reichstag took place at nightfall on April 30th, supported by artillery and numerous tanks. Finally, one of the Soviet artillery shells managed to open a hole in one of the bricked-up entrances to the Reichstag, through which Soviet troops began to enter the building en masse. What followed next was a grim struggle room by room, and floor by floor. After a few hours, a group of Soviet troops reported by telephone that they had reached the top floor of the building. Immediately afterwards, the special banner with the Soviet flag was sent, with orders to place the flag on top of the building before midnight at all costs. For their part, a small group of 25 soldiers managed to place their banner on a damaged statue at the top of the building, even though fighting continued for several more hours on the lower floors of the Reichstag. The flag in the famous photograph, which wanted to compete with the one recently taken by the Americans on Iwo Jima, was fixed by Captain Makov and a group of artillery non-commissioned officers on the statue of the Goddess of Victory. However, these events were recreated in daylight on May 1st for Soviet propaganda services, and that was the photo that was spread throughout the world. This act by no means marked the end of the fighting in Berlin, which in some sectors continued until May 2nd. Regarding the German garrison led by Lieutenant Barbick, it should be noted that during the last hours of the battle inside the Reichstag, both he and about 100 survivors managed to leave the building and headed north. Although their objective was to leave the city, they were finally surrounded by the Soviets and surrendered during the morning of May 2nd. Finally, the casualties of the Soviet soldiers who stormed the Reichstag are estimated at around 500, and the Germans at slightly less. Do you know the story of the first Soviets who entered Hitler's bunker? Was there German resistance inside Berlin? For in the afternoon on April 30, 1945, Hitler has just committed suicide in his bunker, located in the garden of the Reich Chancellery. This bunker had been Hitler's official residence, since in mid-February 1945 he had to abandon an apartment in the old Reich Chancellery and stay there permanently due to the intense bombings that the capital was suffering. As a curiosity, Luftwaffe ace Hans Rudel offered Hitler to go to Berlin for him on April 26, when the capital was already completely surrounded, and evacuate the German leader in his plane. This offer was rejected by Hitler. One day after Hitler's suicide, after definitively verifying that the Soviets were not going to accept anything other than an unconditional surrender, Goebbels also committed suicide outside this same bunker during the afternoon of May 1st, when the Soviets they were just a few meters away. During that May Day night, most of the personnel still remaining in Hitler's bunker, including workers, assistants, and generals, ended up leaving to participate in a nighttime escape. In this way, during the early hours of May 2nd there were only 2 men alive in the Führerbunker, along with the lifeless bodies of Goebbels' children, and that of some generals such as Bergdorf and Krebs, who had committed suicide in one of the bunker corridors. One of the men alive inside Hitler's bunker was the famous radio operator and former bodyguard of the German leader, Rochus Misch, and the other man was a 36-year-old engineer named Johannes Henschel, who had been left behind till the electric generator continued working. This generator was very important since an underground hospital, with thousands of wounded that was near Hitler's bunker depended on its energy. Because there was no one left from the German government inside the Führerbunker, Rochus Misch decided to leave it around 4 in the morning on May 2nd to try to save himself, although he was finally captured by the Soviets and was imprisoned in Siberia until 1955. Thus, Henschel was the only man inside the bunker when daylight broke on May 2nd, and without knowing it, although it could be expected, he was going to be the first and only German that the Soviets would see when they finally entered in the Hitler's bunker. For their part, the Soviets planned to carry out an assault on the Reich Chancellery during that early morning of May 2nd, using troops from the 5th Rifle Corps of the 9th Shock Army. The assault was eventually carried out through Wilhelmplatz, and met with weak German resistance. Little by little, Red Army troops broke into the compound, and at this point, the Soviets only knew that Hitler had been reported dead in Berlin on April 30th, according to the report that Goebbels had sent them the day before. A special unit led by NKVD Commander Anna Nikolina and 4 male soldiers from the 1050th Infantry Regiment played a leading role in this assault. Nikolina wore a red Soviet flag around her waist, and together with her escort, she made her way to the top floor of the building, placing the flag on the roof. At practically the same time, at 6 o'clock on the morning of May 2nd, General Helmut Weidling, who was in command of the final defense of Berlin, made the official announcement about the surrender of the capital's garrison. However, many of the defenders who were precisely in this government sector, belonging to Waffen SS divisions composed of foreign soldiers such as the Nordland Division, continued fighting. Without a doubt, they were clear that in captivity death awaited them in the same way. According to the testimony of the last man left in Hitler's bunker, around 8 in the morning on May 2nd, Henschel began to hear female voices, which, due to the language, he knew were not German. Immediately afterwards, when the German engineer left the room with the electrical generators to see what was happening, he saw a group of Soviet female soldiers belonging to a traffic management unit. The women pounced on him, demanding that he take them to Eva Braun's room to keep her clothes. In addition, they also kept many of Goebbels's wife's clothes and objects. Once Henschel took them to where they asked and stole the clothes of Hitler's recently deceased wife, the women also forced him to put on women's clothing to humiliate him. When this embarrassing scene ended, the next to enter were women again, this time being nurses, who were going in search of supplies for the wounded. Just like the others, they also took all the clothes they could. A little later, between 9 and 9:30 in the morning, agents of the Soviet political police, also known as the NKVD, arrived to try to locate Hitler and other German leaders. This command acted directly under orders from Stalin, and as we will see later, not even Marshal Zhukov himself knew of its existence. The detachment was led by Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vadas, and the first thing they did was capture the German engineer to guide them inside the bunker. Since the Soviets did not trust the rooms to be booby-trapped, Henschel was ordered to open the door and enter each of the rooms first. As the German engineer later commented, at that time, fires had broken out in several rooms, including Hitler's study room, which led Soviet officials to think that there could be explosives. In addition, they were also afraid that there was a gas trap. Once Henschel showed them several rooms, and the Soviet officers saw that nothing was actually happening, and that the bunker was safe, they sent the German out after asking him where Hitler was, and cordoned off the bunker so that no one else could enter. From this point, the Soviet investigators were left alone in the bunker and began to search everything in search of any evidence that would indicate what had happened to Hitler. Lieutenant General Alexander Vadas was under pressure from Stalin, who wanted to know everything that had happened with Hitler in detail as soon as possible. Despite reports of his death, Stalin seemed to believe that Hitler was still alive. When Marshal Zhukov showed up at the Führerbunker that night with the intention of entering, Steiner prevented him from entering as Stalin had ordered him to do. The false excuse they gave Zhukov was that the bunker was full of traps and was too dangerous. However, Stalin was playing both sides by asking Zhukov to initiate his own investigation to determine what had happened to Hitler. As the search continued, a large number of Hitler's former staff were arrested attempting to escape from Berlin, and were quickly imprisoned for interrogation. In order not to miss anything, Stalin sent a man he trusted to supervise each of the interrogations, with a direct and secure telephone line to Moscow, through which Stalin was detailed word by word what each of the detainees had said. The first to be identified were the two bodies that were found in the Chancellery garden on that same day, May 2nd. The examination carried out by Soviet investigators revealed that the male corpse was wearing a leg brace, and it was quickly learned that it was Goebbels. In any case, his head, although partially burned, was also quite recognizable. Added to the fact that several of the captured bunker attendants confirmed that those bodies belonged to Goebbels and his wife, the matter could be closed quickly. Incredible as it may seem, Goebbels' children were not discovered until the next day. Once they were taken to a makeshift hospital, a Soviet medical team performed autopsies on them and determined that they had been poisoned. Although the Soviet investigations began to bear their first fruits, the most important thing was still missing. It remained to know what had happened to the Führer. All the interrogations that were made to the people who had been in Hitler's bunker responded that either they did not know anything, or that they had witnessed the suicide of Hitler and his wife. Even if the version given to him by most of these people is valid, Lieutenant General Steiner needed to find the body. He did not believe the version that the body could have completely disappeared in a bonfire in the courtyard of the Chancellery. During the afternoon of May 3rd, in a large water tank near Hitler's bunker, numerous corpses were found that seemed to be hidden inside it, which made Steiner think that Hitler's body would be hidden there. They quickly found the body of a middle-aged man wearing a dark suit and sporting the same mustache and hairstyle as Hitler. The next morning, with greater light, the body was removed from the water tank and brought before 6 German witnesses who had previously been with Hitler. 5 said it wasn't Hitler, and 1 said it might be because they did look alike. The corpse attracted much Soviet attention and was photographed and filmed. The apparent cause of death was a bullet hole in the middle of the forehead, suggesting that the man had been executed. Later, many suggested that the body was that of one Gustav Velayer, who was neither more nor less than Hitler's double. Ultimately, the investigation determined that the man was not Hitler and the body was destroyed. One of the Soviet colonels who was part of this investigation detachment ended up finding the remains of 2 other burned bodies buried in the Chancellery garden on May 4th, and once again raised hopes of finding Hitler. The autopsy determined that the female corpse belonged to a woman who matched all of Eva Braun's physical characteristics, although it was not 100% conclusive. Regarding the male corpse, matching it with Hitler's was also quite complicated. The autopsy revealed that the male corpse was 163 centimeters tall. However, Hitler was 174 centimeters tall, which made a difference of 11 centimeters in height. This difference in height is often explained as an effect of fire causing bodies to shrink. However, there was other evidence that did not fit the data we had about Hitler. Due to pressure from Stalin, Soviet investigators tried to close the case as soon as possible and concluded that Hitler and his wife had died in Berlin on April 30th. However, the idea that Stalin conveyed to the rest of the world was that Hitler had escaped. This version of Hitler's escape became the official version in the Soviet Union until 1968, when the Soviets finally admitted that Hitler's remains were under their control. The reason why the other version was spread during the last 23 years was to reinforce his presence throughout the occupied territories, under the threat that Hitler would return under the umbrella of the Western powers. Well, now that we have seen what the Soviet entry into Hitler's bunker was like, and how the investigations developed during the following days, let's finally see what happened to the German engineer they found there. Once he was taken out of the bunker, having guided the Soviets inside, Henschel was imprisoned, and was subsequently charged with sabotage. They basically blamed him for the fires that had broken out inside the bunker and for hindering the investigation. After a 10-year prison sentence, the German engineer was released 4 years later, and it was then that he was able to start a new life in Germany. Finally, he died in Aachen in 1982. On the other hand, the radio operator Rokas Misch died in 2013, being the last living person who had known Hitler personally. So, what did you think of the story about the Soviets entering Hitler's bunker? If you are interested in analyzing what the final resistance carried out by the last Tigers in Berlin was like, I leave you the program that we recently uploaded about it in the description, along with the interview with Daniel Ortega.